Okay, good morning everyone. My presentation is called The Age of Iron, not The Age of Iron Man, as was saying Tudor Lion, in a very bad way. Some authors have pondered about the increasing impact of metal, particularly steel, in the making of the modern habitat. Beyond the Chicago frame, Mies, the Eames, and many others still enter the household in multiple forms, noteworthy in so-called tubular furniture, which was conceived as with recycled bicycle tubes. Following from these properties and this tradition, in a sense, Aldo van Eyck devised many of his remarkable playground structures. Sculptures too explored its properties of this new material, but in terms of ordinary urban experience, this cold and brushed material increasingly substituted the perceived organic warmness of natural, so-called natural materials. So steel entered into the public space in a big way recently. And I'd like to show a way in which it entered into public space, a very familiar one, and one which, in my view, merits attention. There were reactions. Such, for example, was the plea made by Julian Palasma in The Eyes of the Skin, his book, about the non-visual agendas embedded in the architectural projects. Palasma draws our attention to modest mediating devices, such as the door handle. There, one grasps material firmly over and over again. Palasma highlights the way Aalto enhances our daily routines by softening the cold effect of steel, by wrapping the handle in leather, as we see in the picture. The wrapped handle embodies a form of etiquette that he would wish to extend to our habitat and its associated habits, for he seeks a humane, gentle, and comprehensive appraisal to the built environment. It works well within sophisticated domestic ambiances, such as Aalto's Villa Mairia, but when outside the domestic cocoon, things, objects, and experiences confront a brush mode where exposure to public usage demands resilience above gentleness. This presentation looks into a liminal domain of a property line as represented by a steel fence. In our garden city conception, however debased, this edge also represents a meeting point between front garden and street. Its definition has massive repercussions in daily urban experience, and it conceals many of the tensions felt in urban life, yet it seldom receives due attention, perhaps because of its liminal status that places it somewhere in between the domains of architecture, urbanism, garden, and landscape. One can trace the gradual appearance of steel in the street scene. The extraordinary Georgian invention of the terrace house in England represents a landmark in the substitution of the wall facade for the fence. For within the Georgian model, the ranks of houses retreated as if they stepped back from the street just enough to allow for a moat, divorcing the public space from the domestic one. Since then, cast iron railings became dominant in the English urban scene. This typology, in my view, is an extraordinary kind of conception, unprecedented conception of removing the facade from the street and replacing the line of demarcation of the site with a fence. To make things more complicated, the English also excavate a moat behind the fence so that the kind of separation and relationship between house and street becomes even more complex. The steel railing massive presence in our cities coincides instead with the wholesale substitution of the compact urban typology of the patio by the aerated typology of the pavilion. So here we have the kind of conception of the elements that crown the railings, these cast iron railings in the Georgian model. But if we trace the emergence of this material to Santiago, we have to look back into the city of courtyards, such as represented by this plan of Santiago, drawn by a team of architects from the school, which is Santiago 1900, just about the time when the Garden City model begins to substitute this compact model of courtyards. However, at the base, the Garden City model was of a decisive impact upon the way we conceive, organize, and make cities. The model, as we know, migrated from Anglo-Saxon centers. It always drew an emphasis upon singularities, as it highly valued individuality. It is completely opposed and unlike this model in the sense that it is the individual building, the individual property, the family, rather than any other unit that you recognize at first. Whereas here, it is more like a conglomerate of conditions that create the urban block, the street, and also the city. As such, because it valued individuality, it undermined the common space in favor of the private paradise, but it did not always prescribe the physical demarcation of property lines. Here we have the kind of figure ground inversion from the city of blocks to the city of pavilions, as shown by Montserrat Palmer in her study of Providencia, Ciudad Jardín, and on the left, the seminal kind of image of Colin Road that treats the same subject. But not always the demarcation, the Garden City model does not always prescribe demarcation of the street fronts with railings. As demonstrated by Tessot and others, the extensive carpet of the American lawn was an effective mechanism of separation and a means for the preservation of privacy that did away with the need of the fence. Thus conceived, American suburbs conveyed transparency and flow rather than enclosure. Transparency and flow, we should understand those in conceptual terms because it was not meant for people to cross, like to ramble about into private properties, but visually you could, in a sense, ramble about private property. Our story is different, however, for in the massive figure ground reversal operated upon traditional urban fabric, the surge of the pavilion coincided with an incremental surge in protective devices, such as picket fences, dwarf walls, and full-bodied steel fences, with domestic living retreating from the street and family spaces gradually veering towards the backs. Conceived as shields from prying eyes, front gardens became a line of defense as much as an apparatus for public representation. Steel was increasingly used to demarcate the urban boundary, a newcomer in the ranks of building materials. Its ultimate outcome was the substitution of the street facade for the street railing, and likewise, the substitution of mass for filament. Pavilion houses were thus caged with an ambivalent effect upon citizens and householders. For railings also belonged to prisons, henceforth, whether caged in or out, everyone was affected. In looking at garden rails, we make ponderable description of urban landscape, the notion of transparency, the actual and symbolic impact of security in architecture and landscape, the urban embodiment of fear. Developed with an eye for symbolic and actual deterrence, the original drew their imagery from Baroque precedents and warfare. Ranked in series, these railings draw their strength from numbers, with their pointed tops evoking spikes as even ancient military phalanx. It is like an armament paraded on the edge of the street. Rails was seen as transparent, a desirable value that was soon enshrined in local regulations where a mandatory percentage of street frontage was to be made thus transparent through the use of railings. Transparency, as we know, is an unstable architectural quality, for it draws upon unobtrusiveness and invisibility. Clearly, railings perform like auxiliary figures, keeping things in order, much as with the horizontal markings on a musical score, which are meant not to draw attention in themselves, simply to orchestrate the score. Such as this is the theory, for as we will see, the substitution of facades for ranks of rails creates a dense urban landscape. Transparency, we may recall, is a significant modern trope. But these instruments of demarcation simulate security. A paranoid climate increasingly charged the perception of the symbolic deterrent for a notion of calculated injury. Furthermore, because of the neglected visual impact, these become sites for interventions. Thus, retrofitted first-generation garden railings now support razor-edge finials, Vietnam-type barbed wire, and electric lines. The liminal landscape of the street edge becomes more and more an immanent warfare scenario between owners and outsiders, embodying that regressive notion about the outside as a conveyor of menace and negative values, a conception no doubt reinforced by the vested interest of the dynamic and ever-expanding security industry, with its myriad experts concurring in delineating the defensible space. Homes becomes bastions of security, the property edge militarized with its front line backed by an active rear guard that is equipped with sensors, alarms, cameras, flashlights, and security hardware. But the spirit of the garden suburb requires greenery to prevail over building mass. The predominance of green or black hues in fences draws from the primacy of planting, whilst the actual frame often supports climbing species and vertical gardens. Despite the conception of railings as transparent, opacity often becomes the prevailing quality. When space is at the premium, railings conceal illegal forms of occupation of the front garden with ancillary spaces, a covered space, a covered terrace, a room, or maybe a garage. There, one can see an emergent landscape of opaque street frontages, primarily forged in steel, becoming generalized. It is as if a second-order substitution of street models happened quite outside the academic or professional orbits. This street frontage is promiscuous because it has no depth. There is no sufficient mass to it. It collides the public with the private with no mediation other than the visual mediation of steel. It gives nothing away to the public domain, just a statement about property rights. It recasts, however, the continuous opaque frontage of the traditional typology of patios and the traditional corridor street. When thus conceived as supports, railings construe a novel kind of corridor street, one which edged in metal. The notion of a socialized urban grounds was another modern trope, we all know about it, and was allied to the notion of unlimited access to a certain freedom of movement in the city, and the notion of a collective floor that was shared by everyone. Such was the luminous substitute of the corridor street as devised by Le Corbusier, paradoxically devised from his corridor street type studio, a place which looked very much like corridor street in Paris. Things turn in quite other ways. As enclosure becomes a prime subject, it calls for new insights, decisions, and political action. Thank you very much.